International Cultic Studies Association, helping people since 1979. About ICSA. Founded in 1979, the International Cultic Studies Association, or ICSA, is a global network of people concerned about psychological manipulation and abuse in cultic and other high-control environments. ICSA is tax-exempt, supports civil liberties, and is not affiliated with any religious or commercial organizations. Our mission. ICSA provides information, education, and help to those affected by or interested in cultic and other high-control groups and relationships. Join or donate today at icsahome.com/membership. Disclaimer. Views expressed on ICSA websites or in ICSA's publications or events are those of the document's author or speaker and are not necessarily shared, endorsed, or recommended by ICSA or any of its directors, staff, or advisors.
Catherine Moestue grew up in Oslo, Norway, in an upper-middle-class family with 4 siblings. While attending Folk University in Stockholm from 1984 to 1985, she encountered teachers who claimed to have a program to, quote, save starving children, and lured her to participate. The group, which drew on communist teachings, isolated her from her family and made her feel guilty for her privileged upbringing. After years of working hard to save the world, she became disillusioned, and after several attempts, in 1992 she successfully escaped this destructive group by running away. She worked in the advertising industry and managed a radio company before earning her degree in psychology at the University of Oslo and becoming a psychologist, and eventually seeking therapy to deal with her traumatic experience. She's a psychologist in private practice in Oslo and is currently working on her memoirs.
And it's so nice to see everybody here. Thank you for coming. When I signed up for this, I did not know whether I was going to be brave enough at all to have my story out in public. And so when it actually happened last week, I thought it would be great to talk a little bit about it. And if you don't see the slides, I just want to show this. It was front cover of this Saturday magazine. And I had a huge struggle personally before doing this. And since we are talking about shame in cult recovery, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about how much shame and fear I had before I did this. And one of the fears that I had is that, of course, if I share my story, if I share my shame, I'll definitely lose credibility. And I had vivid stories in my head, vivid imagery of how other professionals would now that my whole world would sort of fall apart. Okay, great, Lorna. Thank you for doing this.
Sure.
So, yeah, that's okay. I'm a bit confused about that picture, but and so anyway, I just wanted to say that none of my fears have come true. Sharing the story. Rather, the opposite has happened, that a lot of professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, and even police, lawyers, especially that group, have contacted me and said, and thanked me for sharing that, my vulnerability and humanness, and they said that it really made the world a different place for them now, that they feel that they can also be a wounded healer, and that it was okay. And for me, of course, also it felt so validating, and really so many validating responses. Okay, in the PowerPoint, I just showed the pictures from the magazine, and also I guess people are wondering a little bit about my story. I wasn't planning on talking about my cult involvement today. I was planning to just be a psychologist talking about shame and how we treat shame. But since the article is out, I will tell you a little bit about it. And also that if you are curious about my story, it is in English in a book called Far Out. It's an author called Charlotte MacDonald Gibson. She has 4 chapters about my story in that book, and the book is about encounters with terrorists. And the reason why my story is in there is because the way I was groomed, the way I was radicalized or indoctrinated into changing my name, leaving my parents, leaving my homeland, leaving everything basically that was a part of my former identity in order to save the world. And this was all back in 1984, when the world was facing an enormous starvation, what you call it, famine. As you remember, I guess all of you guys remember, we are the world, the singing that the whole world came together to save the starving children at the time. And myself, I was 19 years old. I was naive in a natural way, I think, as all teenagers are naive. And I was very idealistic. And I moved away from home, from Norway. I'm from Norway. And I went to travel to Sweden because I wanted to be an actress. And they had this kind of fame school in a city very close to Stockholm. And unfortunately, this school had employed a teacher, an English teacher, that was, he became very quickly my friend, as all this story goes. So he was very validating, and he helped me set up work outside of school, helped me start to run. I was a smoker, and I became very healthy. And I guess it was his attention plus the fact that he was so, yeah, I guess like a psychologist now, how we validate empathically and attune ourselves into our clients. I think this was my ever first experience of anybody being so attuned to my emotional needs. And so that was the first love bombing phase. But then he changed his identity after we become really, really good friends. He told me that he actually wasn't the person I thought he was, but that he was in hiding in Sweden, and that he was really a leader of revolution, a guerrilla leader, like a Che Guevara kind of type figure. He painted himself to be. And that he was indeed saving the starving children with his organization. And for me, at that particular moment of disclosure of his secret identity, for me, it was like, I guess, a kind of Jesus moment, because it wasn't only that I had a really good friend that was helping me to become healthy and strong, but I just, in my heart of heart, knew that somebody had to do something about the crisis in the world. And if you remember, in that time, this was the most exposed famine of all times. So it was every day in the newspaper. And the images that we saw was horrific, the suffering that we saw of the children. And so his disclosure was really, wow, it was fantastic to know somebody. It made sense to me that somebody would do something about the suffering. But as you all know, of course, this was all a lie. I mean, this was a fraud. I just didn't see it at the time. So it was an emotional manipulation. And so the story goes. I guess I'm gonna stop it there and maybe just say that I'm part now of this I Got Out movement, because I think that's what's really helped me talk about my shame, talk about my story, is listening to other people's stories. And of course, reading about other people's stories, that gives me the extra kick, extra push to become courageous. And of course, in therapy, I've been in therapy for many years, and my therapist has always encouraged me to talk about my story. And that doesn't necessarily mean publicly, but as we shall go into in this talk later, how we treat shame is really helping people to access and express those hidden emotions, the part of ourselves that were exiled, the part that we hide away, because shame really does say, please don't look at me. You know, something bad happened and it must be because I'm a really, really bad person. Certainly, I have believed this for 30 years um, because I think it's hard to get at shame when shame is really deep. All therapists know we have to work with shame, but how are we going to work with shame? And so I think it's important for us to explore that. How can we work with shame? And the first, I'm an emotion focused therapist, and from an emotion focused perspective, we would look at the cult experience as having unmet needs, that our needs, our personal authentic needs, were not validated and not met. And so therefore it creates a loneliness, and these lonely, shameful parts are hidden away because when when abuse happens and when the trauma happens, we have to protect ourselves. And that's why the shame comes and really helps us to subjugate, to hide away those parts of ourselves that are not um, helpful in the situation that we're in. Okay, so without the, I hope this makes sense, but yes, I'm an emotion focused therapist, and I just want to look at shame from that point of view, that we have a mantra that we say, we follow the pain. And so how you help a client to access that shameful part is always, first of all, about the therapeutic relationship, because that in itself is a new experience. Because shame says that cannot I cannot look my therapist in the eye. I cannot look anybody in the eye, because when they look at me, they will see something awful. They will see that I'm bad. And so when that doesn't happen in therapy, when the therapist is really empathic, attuned, and knows about the cult dynamic and can explain and can just really attune to your emotional needs, then that becomes a new experience. So I would say that of course is the most important part of anything, that you have the safe space to explore the shame. And so to treat it, we really have to go back to the original story, because you have to remember what happened in that moment when you hid away or exiled that part. In my story, it's kind of easy to talk about shame because I changed my name. My name is now Catherine, and in the cult, my name was Roxy. And so Roxy, she became this, my cult personality, or you could say the shame personality, or that part of me that was protecting my real authentic self from being harmed by Cornell, which was the name of my cult leader. And so coming out, running away from the cult, and I'm always very proud to talk about how I ran away from the cult. But after I did do that, I did not want to talk about Roxy. And I think that's also very common, that you just don't want to, you just don't even know how a cult experience influence your mental health, because those feelings are not accessible to you. And so going to therapy or finding the courage to trust somebody again after abuse it's been very, very hard process. But so I just want to say that to help people treat shame, what first helped me was in 2005 when I went to an ICSA conference and I met Dr. Robert Cialdini. He had a keynote talk there. And the talk was called "You Don't Have to Be a Fool to Be Fooled." And I asked to interview Dr. Cialdini. I was a psychology student at the time, and he said yes. And then he asked me something in an email. He said, you know, I've studied cults my entire life, or influence, and it's really, really hard to get out of cults. So how on earth did you manage to get out? And just having a professor, somebody credible, ask me that very validating question was the beginning for me to have this, what I call this new experience, the non-shameful, very accepting, loving, inclusive kind of communication. And later on, when Cialdini gave the talk at the ICSA conference, he mentioned the 6 principles of influence. And basically, those principles are talking about our automatic behavior or responses when it comes to 3 fundamental needs that we have. We all have a need to feel good about ourselves, and we all have a need to make good decisions, and we all have a need for belonging. And understanding those needs and how people can exploit those needs was very, very humanizing for me, to understand how my shortcut thinking, how the cult leader was taking advantage of this shortcut thinking by, first of all, isolating me from other people's influence. And then Cialdini explaining how it's not the personality, it's not the self that makes these decisions, but rather the high stakes situation. It makes it impossible to say no, even if you should have said no. And yeah, so I think that is very de-shaming, to feel part of a larger collective, feel part of understanding these, how the brain works. And we can also de-shame in terms of physiology, just talking about how my nervous system, how when you're in a threatening situation and you can't fight or flee from that situation, your brain makes an automatic decision to subjugate or to freeze, just like a deer in the headlight kind of situation. So I think understanding trauma is understanding physiology, understanding how my nervous system actually makes that decision for me. And I think Cialdini's principles does the same thing by understanding this automatic behavior. And so if we can help our clients to reframe and imagine it as a reflex, that shame is a reflex also, that if you can imagine you go to the doctor and the doctor has this hammer and he hits your knee underneath the kneecap and your leg is jerked up. And I think hardly anyone would feel shame about doing that. And so it should really be in the same way. When you are isolated and threatened, you really have no other way than a reflex to subjugate. So I think that's a very helpful way. Yeah, so I just want to say what's different about emotion focused therapy is that we use, we have this, one of the principles in emotion focused therapy is that you change emotion with emotion. And so really having a strong and harsh inner critic, you want to help the client to separate a little bit from that so that they don't over-identify with that harsh inner critic. And so using chair work is one way, it's a Gestalt principle, but it's one way that's really, really helpful, that you have to attune moment to moment and watch the client's emotions. And when the marker comes for, and you hear the inner critic, you can invite that critical part, using part language and putting that part in a chair. which really helps the client to, sitting in his own chair or her own chair, to express finally those unmet needs, those feelings that were never felt or never expressed. And just having them emerge is also creating this kind of new experience, and giving them a chance to process the emotion, and talking back to the shame, just first of all expressing how they feel when they hear this shaming part, the critical part: you're stupid, you're fat, you're an idiot, all these uh, things, and just expressing that it really makes me feel sad, worthless, lonely. Because before, if we don't express the emotion, we don't really own it. The emotion is there, but you don't own it and become an agent of your emotions. So that's one. Becoming aware of what you're actually feeling is a beginning. And then I really want to help the client. I follow the pain. We say we follow the pain all the way down to hell. That's an expression. um, Thinking of it as a beach ball. If you hold it on the water, and you know that when you let it go, it's going to pop up. And so what happens when we follow the pain all the way down, saying, that must be, you follow the hurt, then comes the anger. And so the healthy anger emerges. And it's when the shame says, hide away, please don't see me, I don't want to be seen. When the anger comes, of course, that mixes with the shame. The shame doesn't disappear completely, but now you have two emotions, and you sort of change the process of emotion with another emotion. If you can imagine, yeah, like in the bloodstream, if shame has a neurochemical, it's usually very, very painful for the body to feel shame. And now you have anger, you have another set of neurochemicals in your bloodstream, and now there is this mix. And so we try to help the client become healthily angry, uh, not with the critical part necessarily, but with the messages. Because usually when you listen to the critical part, there is often an internalization of, of the cult leader's messages, the ideology, or it could be a critical parent. But when you become curious also with the critic, and say, why are you telling me all this? What's going on with you? Then we learn that the critic will usually say, if I don't criticize you, you will be hurt again. And so making the client aware that the shame is really a protective part, that the shame was adaptive back then when it happened. Now it's maladaptive. Now it's like hell. It's like having hell is kind of death to walk around with a lot of shame. But it used to be very, very protective, and you don't want to get rid of that protective part. You just want to tune it down for size. You just really want to tune that down and say, this is not very helpful for me now that you are telling me that it's dangerous to share the story publicly, for instance, as in my case, which was rather the opposite. I just can't believe. I feel so much more grounded. And I'm not going to say everything is fantastic now that I've shared my story publicly, because I believe in growth and healing, and I can feel it happening inside me. But I'm a not believer in this toxic recovery idea, which I see somewhere on Instagram constantly. This now I've totally, I'm totally perfect. So this is not the case, but I really must say that talking shame, helping me to access, taking control of the narrative, has been so helpful. And especially because in my cult life or years, there was a student who was raped. And I was a part of introducing my cult leader to the student. And this has been a huge source of my moral injury. And also the other cult members were taught that the rape never happened. And I knew that it had happened because I had read that student's, what you call it, testimony. And so telling my story is not only about telling the truth about the cult dynamic to the outside world, but it's also about telling the truth to myself. And so I think that has been very, very healing. And of course, it gives me a lot of sadness also. It's so I just wanted to say that it's not like, yay. I feel very proud that I've done it, but it's also a mix with sadness, that it actually was that severe. So I hope this gives you some idea. Of course, half an hour is a very short time, but I can sum it up basically what the principles are. And for, as you all know, it's the relationship with the therapist that is the most important, because that gives that new experience. But we can also help people decrease shame by psychoeducation about the trauma responses in the body. We can also use Cialdini's principles that really helped me to understand the automatic thinking and why my critical abilities were knocked offline, and that it can be likened to a kind of reflex, and it's part of our common humanity. And there is nothing more de-shaming to me than being part of a larger collective. And of course, opening up that dialogue with the critical part, and helping the self express emotion so that we can change emotion with a stronger emotion, a more true emotion. And finally, this is a process, but finally you will get to the anger, if you follow that pain far down, or attune yourself to that pain, the anger will come. And that is really, really healthy for the person to see that the shame is just a part of them. It's not who they are. And so helping that separation, using chair work has, what you call it, speeded up a recovery for some, not all, but for some. Some people have so much shame that they don't want to do the chair work, but we can always do chair work in one chair, if you see what I mean. You could always explore the fear and the shame. What is that part saying? Just using the part language is very, very helpful. And also looking at the eyes, people don't come into therapy and say, please help me with my shame. They come in and they are very depressed. And so shame can hide in so many places. But when I see people gazing down or looking down very much and having a hard time looking me in the eye, then I can ask, what's it like for you to look me in the eye? Or what's it like for you to look other people in the eye? And that's usually when you can access the shame. Then they will talk about it. Then they will say, I can't do that because I feel bad. So shame is saying that I'm a bad person. Something bad happened to me, therefore I must be a bad person. And I think one last thing that I'd like to say also, that in our community or in our culture, we often say that we are responsible for how other people treat us, And so if I was groomed, if I was tricked into becoming Roxy, what does that say about me? So that's really a dangerous thing if we think that we are responsible for when other people mistreat us or abuse us. So I think that's a very important part also, to be careful with our language, that if we say you have to forgive yourself, for instance, that sounds innocent, but that's also really unhelpful if there isn't something that you can forgive, that if it wasn't your fault in the beginning, that the abuser abused you. So it's important to put the blame or the blame and the shame where the shame belongs. And just reminding ourselves that shame, we usually have 4 strategies to deal with shame. And one is to criticize others or shame other people. The other is to shame the self, saying I'm fat, stupid, horrible, immoral, whatever. And then the third option or strategy that we normally use is to avoid the triggers of shame. And that's what I've been doing for 30 years when it came to telling my story publicly. That's definitely avoiding my fear that the part of me, that tough part of me, is saying, I'm never going to let other people mistreat you again. And so I just felt that if I become public, then I will be shamed again. But that has not happened. And so, and the fourth strategy is just numbing feelings altogether, not feeling anything. And so those are the 4 ways that shame can show up as strategies. I think I've used all 4. Yeah. Okay. So I hope this was useful and that you will get the slides afterwards. And yeah, and we're opening up for questioning as well, aren't we?
Yes, now we will. And the irony is that you have shown so much courage in not only this article, in leaving the group, in forging ahead in your world of helping others as a clinical psychologist, and being in therapy for yourself to grow and develop and deal with all these scary things and the terrible feelings of shame. And it is ironic how you and so many other people are so courageous, and you were filled with so much shame.
Yeah.
And we'll go to the thank you. Thank you so much for speaking today.
Thank you for participating. If you're interested in continuing to support ICSA, please join or donate at icsahome.com/membership.